All right, everyone, we're going to have a look at adaptations. In the book, this is called Adaptations to a Niche, I think. And I will warn you now, it's going to be a long one, and you're going to learn more about camels than you ever thought you needed or wanted to know, because they are an example of an organism that is particularly adapted to its niche. So before we get going, there's a couple of definitions that you guys need to be aware of. First of which is ecology, which is the study of the relationships of organisms to one another and to their physical environment. So when we're talking about ecology, that's what we're looking at. How are those organisms related to each other? What is their relationship to each other? And what is their relationship to their physical environment? There's then this niche that we've kind of been speaking about in previous lectures, and kind of said to you guys it was the role of an organism, and that's what it is. So it's the role of an organism within the habitat in which it lives. So it's kind of a hard idea to get your head around, and an organism can fit into more than one niche. So some examples of niches are organisms that eat grass. So that would obviously be quite a large one in which multiple organisms would fit in, and it's kind of general. Or you can bring it down to something that's sort of more smaller and specific. So organisms that feed by cleaning the teeth of other larger organisms. And you can categorise them up, the niches, into things that they eat, which are the examples I've given you, or the particular bits in which they live. So, in a habitat, organisms could live within a pond or a tree. So you can kind of base it on habitats or eating habits or behavioural habits. But that's what a niche is. And a successful species is well adapted to its niche because that increases its chances of survival, increases its chance of breeding, increases its chances of passing on its genes and its adaptations onto the next generation. So we're going to have a look, as I said to you guys, at a camel and all of its specific adaptations. But broadly, before we move on to that, we can categorise adaptations into either anatomical, physiological or behavioural. And they have different meanings and sort of different examples. So anatomical is to do with the form and structure of an organism, so what it actually looks like. So some examples might be a thick layer of blubber. So animals like whales have that, for example, to help with insulation in the sea. Or they could have sticky hairs to capture insects. So there are certain plants that have that as an anatomical adaptation. So it's what they physically look like, the physical things they have in their body. Okay, we've then got the physiological, and this is the way that the body of the organism works. So it includes differences in biochemical pathways or enzymes. So it's not what they look like, but it's actually their physiology, how their body works, their chemical reactions. So an example is in diving mammals, so mammals obviously that dive underwater for long periods of time, whether that's because they live there, back to our whales, or whether they have to do that to hunt. The reason why they can stay underwater longer than non-diving organisms is because when they're underwater, they actually decrease their heart rate. And so that decrease in heart rate means not as much blood is pumped around the body as quickly. So it means that it takes longer for the oxygen all to be used up in respiration. So it means they don't have to surface as much to replace that oxygen because it's not being used as rapidly. So that's your example of a physiological change, because they're changing something about their body and the way it operates, not about their appearance, which is what would more come under the anatomical category. And then lastly, there's the behavioural, and this is changes to programmed or instinctive behaviour. So some examples are that insects and reptiles orientate themselves to get the maximum sunlight when the air temperature is low. The opposite can also be true. So animals can orientate themselves sort of away from sunlight to try and keep their temperature cooler if they're hot. Social behaviour such as hunting as a team or huddling together for warmth come under behavioural adaptations. So again, if you're hunting as a team, lions, animals like that, pride animals, pack animals tend to hunt as a team, increases your chances of survival. I'm sure you've all seen videos of the penguins all huddling together, again to keep warm, so that comes under a behavioural adaptation. And also migrating to avoid harsh conditions. So animals that migrate south for winter, if they live in the northern hemisphere, that is a behavioural adaptation. That means they're more likely to survive through to the next year, whereas if they stayed in their actual other habitat during the winter, they might not survive. Okay, so as I said to you, we're going to look at camels now, and there is a lot. Okay, I've taken this all from the textbook, obviously. So if at any point you can't really read my handwriting or anything like that, because I have sort of scribbled it about, then please have a look in your textbook for kind of a more clear version of this. But Camels are a really good example, okay? Nowhere in your spec does it say you specifically have to learn about camels, but it's the one that's included in the textbook, and actually it's a really good example to have because they've got so many adaptations of anatomical, physiological and behavioural. So they're an organism that's really kind of ticked off all the boxes in terms of adapting to their niche. And they live, as you guys know, live and breed in some of the hottest, driest and most inhospitable niches. So obviously they're living in the desert. You know, camels are a common sight here in the UAE, and they're really large mammals. So it's quite unusual that, you know, such a large mammal is able to survive in such a harsh climate. And because they have such a huge range of anatomical, physiological and behavioural adaptations is the reason why they're able to survive where many other organisms are not. So starting off with the anatomical adaptations. So remember, this is what they actually look like, their anatomy, what their body has in its appearance. So you will have looked at camels in the lower down the school. I'm 100% sure of it. So some of these adaptations are going to be familiar to you, or you could kind of just work them out because, you know, you've seen a camel or a picture of a camel in your life. But they have large eyes, so this gives them good vision in many directions, and also they've got long eyelashes, and those long eyelashes help to protect their eyes against the sand in sandstorms. Their nostrils are long and slit-like, and a camel can close them to protect against the sand or the wind. So we can't close our nostrils, unless you physically put your fingers over them. So obviously when we're out in a sandstorm, all the sand goes up your nose, but for a camel that doesn't need to happen. And their upper lip is split, hairy and prehensile. So what that means is it can sort of be used almost like a finger. It's not fully prehensile, so they don't have, complete independent control over it, but they can control its movement somewhat. And that allows them to identify and gather food and avoid thorns in plants. So an adaptation common to plants in the desert is to have these thorns. So obviously if you're a camel trying to eat them, you want to avoid them. So this prehensile quality of their upper lip allows them to do that. And then lastly, most famously of a camel, they have their hump on the back, and that insulates them from the heat of the sun. And because the fat is so concentrated here and they don't have a lot of fat stores over the rest of their body, it means that it's easy evaporation of sweat from the rest of their skin. Okay, so where you've got fat, so we store fat kind of all over really, it makes evaporation of your sweat a little bit more difficult. But because their fat is so concentrated and it's so thin or sparse anywhere else, that sweat can evaporate much more easily from the rest of their skin. And obviously sweat evaporation leads to heat transfer to the surroundings. So, you're reducing the amount of heat, you're cooling down that camel. We've then got our physiological adaptation. So remember, this is how their body works. And this can be grouped into two different adaptations. One to do with sort of water control and one to do with thermoregulation, which is the control of temperature. And that's the one we're going to look at first. So their skin is covered in fine hairs, which can be erected to trap an insulating layer of air at cold nights. So we often think about a camel being hot and trying to keep cool, but as you guys know, in a desert at night it can actually get really, really cold. So the camel needs to be able to cope with that as well as the heat. So it uses these fine hairs to trap that layer of air to keep it warm during the night. A camel can withstand a wide variation of core body temperature. So what that means is most mammals will maintain their core body temperature within sort of a 2-degree window. So if it drops more than 2 degrees or raises more than 2 degrees, that is a real issue. But, in ideal situations, a camel would also have that similar range. However, the situations are not always ideal in its environment. So under heat stress, or if the camel is particularly dehydrated, then it can allow its core temperature to vary over 6 degrees. So again, it can either decrease by 6 or more likely increase by 6 degrees. And so having this sort of variance and this allowance means that the camel gets to save energy and water because it doesn't need to produce so much sweat. So when our body core temperature increases by sort of 2 degrees and more, we start to really, really sweat to try and drop it back down again. Camel isn't going to do that. It can wait until sort of 6 degrees before it starts to sweat. So again, it's helping it to retain more water and lose less, which is especially important when it's, warm or it's particularly dehydrated. Camels can lose up to 30% of their body weight through water loss and then make it up in 10 minutes, drinking water for a 10-minute period without changing the osmotic potential of the blood. So this is really, really important. So they can lose so much of their body weight through water loss, but can make it up really, really quickly, and nothing happens to the osmotic potential of their blood. So the blood doesn't become thick and unable to flow when the camel is extremely dehydrated. So this is obviously an extreme dehydration. This isn't you forgot to have a drink at break time and now you've gone and done peeing, you feel thirsty. This is extreme, haven't drunk for 10 days kind of thing. So, the blood is kind of adapted so that it doesn't lose its ability to flow and obviously provide oxygen, etc. to the rest of the camel. And then back to the hump again. So this is where most of the fatty tissue is stored, as we've said before. And it also, acts as a food store for them, but it also helps with their water and their sort of thermoregulation as well. So the fat is broken down to release energy in respiration. So in times of low food, obviously that hump is going to be broken down in cellular respiration. But as you guys know, water is released as a byproduct from cellular regulation. So that can help with sort of temperature control as well as water. Okay, I've got a whole other sheet to talk to you about camels. So I'm actually going to start that in a second video. So please come back to me in part 2.